Welcome to Capital Forum's 6th Annual Antitrust Thought Leaders Interview Series, sponsored by KL Discovery. I'm Teddy Downey, and I'm delighted to be joined today by FTC Commissioner Terrell McSweeney. Terrell, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start by talking a bit about the Cloaca retrospective, which I know you've spoken quite a bit about. The study has also generated some pushback from the chairman and from BE. I wanted to ask your thoughts whether the FTC as an institution more broadly has grappled with the Cloaca findings and whether it's had an impact on the agency's approach to merger enforcement more broadly.
Well, look, I think the Cloaca study is teeing up a very valid question, which is to say, are we under enforcing an antitrust law? This is a big subject of discussion in the policy space more generally right now, as people are doing research about concentration at the macro level in our economy and wondering whether lax antitrust enforcement is somehow connected to it. Again, I'm not saying that it is or is not. I think a lot more evidence is necessary here, but I think what the Cloaca study has been valuable in explaining is that maybe we're overly preoccupied with false positives. Maybe as an enforcement agency, I ought to worry about missing those anti-competitive transactions that are on the line or are a close call, as opposed to worrying about over-enforcing. So I took the report and thought it was valuable. I think I recognize it's been criticized by FTC economic staff in their personal capacity. I think that's a healthy dialogue for the economists to be having about methodology, and I respect that. I think it's important for them to engage in that conversation. I want to recognize that it's also very challenging to do what Dr. Cloaca is doing, which is to study kind of but-for cases and predictions and whether analysis was right, and to try to analyze what could have happened. And so I think this is a very challenging thing to do, and I think it's a good contribution that he's making. At the same time, I think it's appropriate for economists and experts to engage in a dialogue about those methodologies. What I take away from it as an enforcer, though, is that we have to have our eyes open. We need to be careful. We need to be careful with remedy. We need to be careful in making sure that we really identify the competitive issues and have either remedy or action taken to address them.
And that brings me up to another question about remedies, which again, there's been retrospectives on the remedies, and generally those have come back with what seems to be a clean bill of health, or at least what leadership has, I think, kind of promoted as a clean bill of health. But you do have some of these high-profile situations in rental cars, grocery, dollar stores that are pretty well known as the remedies not working. And I'm wondering if there's been a little bit of a disconnect between what the FTC is reporting about its remedies study and what we've actually observed recently in terms of the efficacy of some of these remedies, and whether or not we should expect some change going forward related in that area.
Well, look, the FTC is always studying itself, the efficacy of its remedies. So in 2017, we reported out again a study that we had conducted of our remedies. Now, we did find that a lot of the remedies succeeded. That's not a bad thing, but I disagree that we just give ourselves a clean bill of health. I think the study covered a lot of situations in which there were some issues. It identified some of the problems, such as making sure buyers really have the assets they need to compete. It's a pretty big deal. And it identified an important thing that I really do want to talk about, which is that there may be some reluctance to contact staff or monitors when problems do arise in the divestiture process. And that seems to be an issue that we'd like to stay on top of. So if issues are arising, it's always a good idea to get everybody involved to see if we can help come up with a solution. To me, some of the key lessons that we're learning around remedies is making sure that we are fully thinking through the efficacy of them. I think the staff does an excellent job of that, that we are getting the right assets into the right hands so that competition can be maintained, understanding what is required for a business in order to do that. And I think we always learn valuable lessons when we're researching how well things have worked. Of course, it varies depending on the industry. And I think it's important for the FTC to continue to monitor how well it's doing. You know, historically, the emphasis on structural remedies does come out of the FTC studying itself and trying to understand how well different remedies are working. Doesn't mean we never use behavioral remedies. Sometimes they're appropriate, but our emphasis is generally on structural remedies, partly because we have understood over time those are the best at maintaining competition and addressing competitive harm.
And I want to stay on this issue of structural versus behavioral and bring up another question, which is on vertical mergers. And in light of AT&T Time Warner, have you personally, or has the FTC more broadly, become more hawkish on vertical mergers recently? Or is the way to interpret that challenge as sort of a blip on the radar screen on the DOJ side of things, rather than a trend more generally, toward more enforcement on vertical, and also, even when it comes to vertical, perhaps even an emphasis on structural remedies as opposed to behavioral?
Well, look, I don't think the vertical case is an outlier by any means. We've been looking at some data on this, and since 2000, the FTC and DOJ have challenged 22 vertical mergers. That's about one per year. So I think that's a smaller part of our overall merger workload for sure. But we also continue to regularly investigate these transactions. So to me, vertical issues can be real. They can involve entry and foreclosure, and we see them. We just in fact released a closing statement in the FTC's investigation of the Essilor-Luxottica transaction, which was largely vertical in nature, in which we explained how carefully we had investigated issues around the transaction. That transaction was looked at globally, and all of the enforcement agencies came to similar conclusions, but after careful exploration of whether there were going to be issues that were raised by that transaction. So I think that it's not a tremendous surprise, and it's not an outlier in antitrust. I do think antitrust agencies should be looking at vertical issues. That is consistent with what we are able to do, and I think we need to be explaining very clearly the frameworks we're using to do that.
Okay, perfect. And in February of this year, you wrote a piece called "Data Innovation and Potential Competition in Digital Markets," and I was wondering if you could talk about some of the ideas that you really wanted to highlight with that piece.
Sure. I also think potential competition and innovation effects and quality effects are very important for enforcers to understand, especially as we look at very large companies with a tremendous amount of power buying smaller innovators. Now, there's nothing wrong with that on its face, but I think it's important for us to be able to be thinking about whether there are harms to innovation, harms to quality competition, whether potential competitors that may be competing with assets and innovating are being taken off the board. And we're able to do that, and we have been doing that. So technology is an area in which those issues can arise, obviously, because we have situations in which we have non-price effects. So we have effects around quality and innovation that aren't necessarily price-oriented. That's partly because of the way those business models work. If you're talking about a platform, for example, you may have a paying side and a free side, and you want to be able to look at the effects on both sides of that platform. It's also a big deal when we think about the role data is playing. It is a different thing depending on what it is. Is it an asset? Is it a product? And I think competition authorities are well equipped to understand and analyze data and whatever it is in a particular transaction, but they have to be aware of it. Same goes for algorithms. I think we're capable of understanding pricing algorithms, for example, and the role they may be playing. We need to have our eyes open to how the technology may be affecting competition. And in the case of, for example, price discrimination, it might be making smaller and smaller product markets as we put people into more and more defined groups of consumers. So I think there's some interesting issues there. Some of them the agencies haven't really encountered yet, but I definitely wouldn't describe them as sort of sci-fi fantastical.
Right. And I kind of stay in the same vein, and I don't mean to throw you a curveball at all, but talking about data, innovation, potential competition, digital markets, you've got some extremely big and powerful players, as you mentioned, You've got a whole new slate of commissioners coming in. You've got hearings on the Hill for Facebook. I imagine that the other platforms will come under scrutiny as well over time. Do you see any big, and there's been a call for more monopolization cases, which I got a little bit of a sense from that maybe in your piece you're sort of hinting in that direction. Do you see a big monopolization case in one of these big dominant technology markets in the future?
Facts matter. I think Section 2 cases are important. The FTC has been bringing them, and it ought to continue to bring them. The facts that are key here are market power, of course, establishing that, and then thinking about whether it is being exerted in some way outside of the market in which it exists. And I think those are very fact-intensive investigations. If I had to focus energy, I would say potential competition is really important. I would say looking at the barriers to entry, like are there data barriers to entry? Are there things present that make it really hard for competitors to enter and compete, connected with perhaps anti-competitive conduct? Those kinds of issues I think are very important for enforcers to stay on top of.
I have another question. Kind of in the same vein, and it just occurred to me that you were talking about defining these markets differently and related to algorithms and big data and things like that. Has it been brought up at all that when it comes to these dominant markets that engage in advertising, that as they're accumulating all this data, that the market is not really an advertising market, but more like a surveillance industry? It's like, you're collecting all this information about people and you're sort of letting people get in on the surveillance that you're doing because the data is so 360 degrees, it's so comprehensive. Has any of that come up at all? I've read some recent articles that are sort of suggesting surveillance economy. We certainly write about that a little bit. Has that come up at all?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a kind of robust policy dialogue outside of the four corners of the enforcement buildings, right? That is an important one that's talking about the power of technology and the power of data and the power of some of the technology and the platforms that we're using in our daily lives. I've heard very interesting presentations on attention markets, for example. Of course, we've been thinking about the role that data may be playing. Of course, you want to think about how much power does someone have in advertising markets. I think antitrust enforcers and antitrust tools are flexible enough to keep pace with very dynamic changes in the markets. But it's important to remember that we also have a framework that likes to get pretty specific about what markets we're talking about and who's got power in them and how to define that. So sometimes the broader conversation it runs off those rails just a little bit. I'm thinking, of course, of we've had these very high-profile hearings here in Washington this week where Mark Zuckerberg was testifying, and we've heard senators say he's a monopoly, and we've heard other people use the term monopoly, and I think that's absolutely fine for people to use the word and to talk about it, but I think it's important for antitrust enforcers to be mindful and to remind people that that means something very specific. In our context, in the US, of course, legally acquired monopoly is not a problem. It's what you do with that power that matters. And we have very specific frameworks that we use to define market power as well. So there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes between the dialogue that's happening and maybe the antitrust tools. And I think it's important for antitrust enforcers to be clear about the tools we use and how we use them and some of the limitations of those.
And as we, again, move into a new slate of commissioners, are there any things that you wish that you had gotten to or that you think is on the agenda for them that they're going to need to take under consideration and take a lead on when they come in?
Well, I've been at the Federal Trade Commission for 4 years, and it's a fantastic job. I think that they're going to have a wonderful time working at the FTC, which is filled with incredible staff of people who are doing fantastic work protecting consumers and competition. So sure, there's tons of things that we haven't gotten to yet because there's always more to do. But I think that they're coming into the FTC at a really important time. in which it will be important to maintain the independence of the agency, the bipartisanship of the agency, and to really use the agency's ability to study and report on some of these big issues that everybody's talking about, which really do have to do with concentration in the economy, the extent to which it's connected to things like labor market mobility and income inequality and economic inequality, issues like common ownership, which are interesting, and there's a lot of growing literature on issues of how do antitrust frameworks map onto highly dynamic technology markets. When do we consider innovation and quality effects? I think maybe the one case that I wasn't able to sort of find and bring while I was an FTC commissioner, but I think is important, are cases that the FTC can bring, really looking at standalone quality and innovation effects even when there aren't price effects, especially dealing with platforms. I think those kinds of cases are going to be important. And I think continuing to be mindful of coordinated effects as well in the merger environment. And of course, I'm sure there will be interesting conduct cases out there as well. So I look forward to seeing how the new commissioners prioritize all this range of really important issues and which ones they put at the top of the list and how they move forward.
Yeah, as do I, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an amazing conversation. I can't thank you enough for doing it.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All right, great.